Hi, I'm Brian Dilg, and I'm here to explain how a lens aperture works. Now, the truth is that a camera spends most of its time keeping light out. Well, an aperture does exactly the same thing as the pupil in your eye. It controls how much light gets in. So, how does it work? Well, the aperture itself is a very precise little mechanism that sits inside every lens. And you can see here exactly what it looks like. There are a bunch of little blades, and they all rotate at exactly the same time, and they effectively create a variable size opening. Well, that determines ultimately how much light is going to pass through the lens and hit your imaging sensor. And we call that opening the aperture. So what's the point of this very fancy variable aperture mechanism? Well, it's very simple. You want to be able to shoot pictures no matter how dark or how bright it is. So changing the size of that aperture is one way of adjusting to lighting conditions. So very simply, opening the aperture admits more light. Well, that's great when it's dark outside. There's not much light to work with. Using a small aperture is great when it's sunny outside and you have more light than you need. Smaller means less light, bigger means more light. Now you're going to hear the words iris, diaphragm, and aperture floating around. They really mean exactly the same thing. To recap, a larger aperture admits more light. A smaller aperture admits less light. Like the other settings on your camera, you can control this manually, or you can let the camera control it automatically. We go into detail about different ways of working with that in our video on shooting modes. Now you've probably already noticed these numbers floating around in your viewfinder. They look a little more complicated than 1, 2, 3, 4, but all they tell you is how big that aperture is and how much light is passing through your camera. And we call these numbers f-stops. So let's break it down. F is just the name of the numerical scale, like kilometers or miles when we refer to distance. The word stops refers to the fact that we stop at specific numbers at intervals rather than just continuously changing like an old-fashioned volume control. All you have to remember is those precise numbers are great because they tell us exactly how much light is reaching the imaging sensor. So here's the key to understanding these f-stop numbers. The higher the number, the smaller the opening. The lower the number, the larger the opening. So let's take some examples. On a sunny day, you're typically going to see the higher numbers like f11, f16. In darker situations, you're going to see the smaller numbers like f4 and f2.8. Now the camera is going to help you by always displaying the current f-stop in the viewfinder and on one of the two LCD screens here or on the back of your camera. So keep an eye on those. So if the only reason to choose a specific aperture was to adapt to different lighting conditions, this whole business would be pretty cut and dried. But here's the thing. When you change your aperture, you change how much of the world is in focus out in front of the camera. So let me explain. You focus on a point here in space, and you may think of that as the only thing that's sharp, but in fact there's always a range further away from the camera and closer to the camera that's also acceptably sharp, and we call that range depth of field. So when you change your f-stop, you change your depth of field. Specifically, the smaller the aperture, the greater the depth of field. A large depth of field means more of your image will be in focus, whether it's close to your camera or far away. And those would be the smaller apertures with high f-stop numbers like f16 or f22. Now this is really common in traditional landscape photography where you want to show the whole view crisply from background to foreground. A wide aperture like f2.8 will let a lot of light into your camera, but you'll have very shallow depth of field. But that can actually look great in a portrait when you want everything except your subject to be nice and blurry. It does get a little challenging though if your subject doesn't like to hold still, like with kids and pets. Well, thanks for watching, and be sure to check out our other videos for more great information.